So if any of you are wondering how in the world Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall, one of the best theories about why he fell off the wall is contained in a police investigator's report when he was called to the scene and filled out his report, and I want to read a portion of his report to you, just so you know. He begins, "It was a quiet day, the sun was coming up, the birds were singing. I had just settled into my chair at the station when the phone rang. The voice on the other end said, 'I have some bad news for you. It's Humpty. He's fallen and gone to pieces, and I don't think all the king's horses and all the king's men will be able to put him back together.' When I arrived at the scene, it was a mess. There were pieces of eggshells everywhere. I looked up at the wall where it seemed Humpty had been sitting. Did he fall, or was he pushed? It was hard to tell. But one thing I noticed is that there was almost no yolk on the ground. It seemed odd that that much yolk could go very far. So I decided to walk around the neighborhood. I hadn't gone 2 blocks when I spied an omelet stand. A pig in a chef's hat was flipping eggs. A lot of eggs, if you ask me. I took the pig in for some questioning. It wasn't long before he confessed he knew his bacon was cooked. It seemed that Humpty Dumpty had a band that he wasn't going to let the pig be a part of. The pig filled in the rest. "Honest, officer, I only wanted Humpty to tell me how I could join his band. But he said pigs couldn't sing, they could only oink. That is when I lost my temper and gave him a push." Now you know, Humpty was pushed. We've come to the end of our 3-part series on mending the broken places of our lives. We've talked about mending our broken choices and mending our finances. And this morning we want to talk about mending our broken relationships. And as is true with each of these series of sermons, the prayer team will be over here at the cross at the end of the service to pray for you or a friend or someone in your life, any broken places in your life or broken places in the life of a friend. So now that you know that Humpty Dumpty was pushed off the wall, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever felt that there were people in your life trying to push you off the wall? Or maybe you felt like they did push you off the wall. Or maybe you have felt like pushing somebody else off the wall. I don't know about you, but I would put myself in all 3 categories at one time or another in my life. And all of those categories are evidence, indicators of broken relationships. And broken relationships can hurt, like this broken relationship of an adult daughter. She writes, "My father died a year ago. Since then I have ignored my extended family, even though I'm close to my children. And then there's my mother. We have a strained relationship. Christmas passed, and I never phoned my sick mother, even though I live 15 minutes away. Can't stand to be around my older sister. I want my family to be together like we used to be. I want to make it right, but can't just waltz into their lives and say, 'Here I am.'" Or the broken relationship of this dad. He writes, "I have 2 grown daughters who have not spoken to me since their mother and I divorced 12 years ago when they were teenagers. Over the years, I've sent them cards and letters and gifts, but they had never acknowledged them. I always hoped that when they were grown, we might be able to reestablish some kind of a relationship. After all these years, I've started to lose hope that things will ever improve. I used to cry when I would think of them, and the sad thing is, now I don't." Broken relationships can hurt. Broken relationships can be difficult, especially if you call yourself a Christian and your family knows that. Sometimes when you start talking to them about the broken relationship, you can feel like a hypocrite because they know you and they know the things you've done right and the things you've done wrong. One of the things I appreciate about Scripture is full of stories of real people who face real issues, real problems, including broken relationship problems. One of the premier stories of broken relationships is the story of Joseph and his brothers. Let me give you a little backstory. Joseph was one of 12 brothers. He was the most favorite of his father, Jacob. The other brothers, you can imagine, didn't take kindly to that. Joseph would tattle on them. Joseph got the pretty coat. And so one day when the older brothers had a chance, distant from home, they were out watching their flock, and Joseph came, and a couple of the brothers cooked up a plot to throw Joseph into a pit and then maybe kill him, and then not kill him but sell him to slave traders on their way to Egypt. They took Joseph's coat, dipped it in animal blood, took it back to Dad, gave Dad a story about Joseph was eaten by wild animals. And Joseph went off to Egypt as a slave, and then as a prisoner. And then ultimately, because of dreams that he interpreted for the Pharaoh, he was elevated to second in command to help prepare Egypt for a 7-year famine that was coming. And so collected a whole lot of grain during the 7 years of plenty, so that when the 7 years of famine came, he could now distribute it. And so that's where we pick up the story as the tension begins to develop in this broken relationship in Genesis chapter 42, beginning at verse 6. Follow along the story. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, Egypt, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived from Canaan, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." "No, my lord," they answered. "Your servants have come to buy food. We're all sons of one man. Your servants are honest men. We're not spies." "No," he said to them, "you have come to see where our land is unprotected." But they replied, "Your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man, who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more." By the way, that youngest was Joseph's real brother, not half-brother, real brother Benjamin, who took Joseph's place as Dad's favorite, Benjamin, the youngest son. Joseph said to them, "It is just as I told you, you are spies, and this is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place until your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison so that your words may be tested to see if you're telling the truth. If you're not telling the truth, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you're spies." And he put them all in custody for 3 days. On the 3rd day, Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified and that you may not die." This they proceeded to do. Story of a broken relationship. It's something we seem to be very good at. A perennial problem. We know how to slight each other. We know how to hurt each other. But we don't know how to mend and heal. And so what I want to do this morning is unpack this story of Joseph and his brothers and see if there's anything we can learn about mending broken relationships. So let's dive in. At the beginning of the story that we just read, Joseph is now Prince of Egypt, and he's seeing people begin to come from Canaan. It's about 1.5 years into the famine, and he's beginning to wonder, I wonder if there'll be anybody coming from Canaan. And they did. The famine had spread that far. And as men came from Canaan to ask for grain, probably Joseph in his mind was wondering, I wonder if anyone from my family will come. And I wonder if they come, will they recognize me? I mean, Joseph had been a young teenager when they sold him into slavery, and now he was in his early 40s. Egyptian dress, Egyptian language, Egyptian culture, Egyptian manners, Egyptian prince. Would they recognize him? And then one day it happened. The brothers came, and they bowed before him, and Joseph remembered the first dream he had back when his brothers were resenting him. That first dream was a dream of Joseph's brothers bowing down before Joseph, and his brothers didn't like that dream. But here they were, fulfilling the very dream they'd laughed at and scorned. But there was a second dream that Joseph had, you may remember. In the first dream, only his brothers bowed down to Joseph. In Joseph's second dream, his father and the extended family bowed down to Joseph. And so Joseph could have popped the question to his brothers right then, "Don't you know me? It's me." And he could have played the ha-ha, I told you so card. But Joseph didn't do that. And I think, in part, Joseph remembered there wasn't just one dream, but there were two dreams. So here, I believe, is the first key we can discover for mending broken relationships, and that is surrender your dreams for the relationship to God. I think there are times when we have our plans, our timeline, the way we think things should work, and we want them to happen now. And we tell God, God, would you please help me with my plans for mending this broken relationship? When in actual fact, God has dreams for that relationship. Sometimes we want to do it in our way, our timing. Joseph realized that the work that needed to be done in his brothers' lives for there to be a mended relationship was work that Joseph probably couldn't do. It was going to take God doing some of that work. And so Joseph had to surrender his timeline, not impose his plans. God, would you please help me with my plan? But he had to surrender all of that to God and say, you know what? God has two dreams for my family. I don't know how he's going to do this. I don't know when he's going to do this exactly, but I need to surrender my dreams to his plans. It's kind of like what Jesus had to do if you stop to think about it with his earthly family. I mean, maybe one of the hardest things for Jesus to endure in his earthly ministry was a family who didn't understand his ministry. They came looking for him early in his ministry to drag him home because they thought he had a few loose nuts and bolts in his head. I think it was a normal desire for Jesus to want his family, his brothers and sisters, to become followers, faithful followers during his lifetime. But it didn't happen. You see, Jesus had to surrender his own dreams, his own plans for his own family to his Father. Just as he had to surrender his plans and say, Lord, what's your plan for calling disciples? What's your plan for my going to the cross? This was yet another area to surrender his plans to the Father. So for you and for me, it's surrendering my dreams, what I think ought to happen, what I want to see happen, when I want to see it happen. Lord, I surrender my dreams to you. There's a second key here in mending a broken relationship in Joseph's story, and that is that the work that God wanted to do in Joseph's family went far beyond Joseph's family. It began with Joseph's family, moved to forming and shaping a nation called the children of Israel, out of whom came the Messiah. God's dreams, God's plans were far larger than Joseph's. And Joseph not only had to surrender himself to God's dreams for his family, but Joseph also had to ask himself, God, what part do you want me to play in your plans? What part do you want me to play in your dreams? And I think that's one reason why Joseph sent his brothers into custody, into jail for 3 days. I think it threw him a bit that they didn't recognize him. I think he had to figure out, God, what are you doing here? What do you want to do? What's going to happen? And I also think that maybe Joseph changed his mind. Remember he said, I'm someone who fears God? I think God helped him change his mind about how he was going to respond to his brothers after all these years. For instance, he didn't put sand in their bags, which if he wanted to get back at them and spite them, he could. No, he put their grain that they purchased plus the money they spent on that grain in their bag. That's not something you do to people you just accused of being a spy. That's not the way you treat spies. I think Joseph had to figure out, how am I going to respond to them? Am I going to treat them like they treated me? No, he changed his mind, whatever he was thinking, however he thought of getting back at them or punishing them. He gave them food for their journey home. And he changed his mind about how many brothers he would keep back in Egypt. Initially, it was 9 kept back and send 1 home. Now it's keep only 1 and send 9 home. Joseph was beginning to realize these were all kind actions. This was a kind response. This wasn't vitriolic. This wasn't getting back at them. I mean, if he wanted to get back at them, he could have followed through on his accusation that they were spies. You know what they do to spies? You don't want to know what they do to spies in Egypt. But he didn't. And I think instead of loading them with guilt, he gave them grace. Grace they didn't deserve. That's the definition of grace, but grace they didn't deserve. So here's our second key in mending a broken relationship. Assume that God wants you to be an agent of his grace. I once received a telephone call from a woman who was asking for some advice about dealing with her family. It seems that she had gone to a Christian college, and while there, she had been asked to leave because of something she'd done that she didn't feel she was guilty of. And if she was guilty, it wasn't enough of a thing that she should be dismissed. She'd been involved and active in the college, and it hurt her deeply. She felt like she was being excommunicated. She developed bitterness over this, and in her bitterness, she unwisely married and then divorced. And for the next 40 years, every time she went home, her family would remind her of her past. Now, I don't know how much guilt or innocence she had back in college when she was dismissed from college. I can't speak to that. But I have an opinion about how her family treated her for the next 40 years. They may have been thinking that they were ministering to her by reminding her of her sin continually. But I think what they had forgotten is that God wants us to be instruments of grace. And you know why? First, because that's how he dealt with us. But secondly, because grace gives him room to work. If you are treating them with condemnation and guilt, their time is spent reacting to you. But grace gives God a chance to work. And if you read the entire story of Joseph and his brothers, you'll find some of the room that God had to work in the lives of the brothers. For instance, the brothers began to realize that God was involved in this interchange between them and Joseph, whom they didn't know was their brother at the time. They said this in Genesis 42. They said to each other, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother." Now you have to understand, this happened 20 years ago, what they did to Joseph. They hadn't spoken of it to anybody. Dad didn't know. They lived with that memory. Verse 28, their hearts sank and they turned to each other trembling and said, "What is this that God has done to us?" God's involved in this. We're accountable to him. They weren't reacting to Joseph. They were reacting to what God was doing. So when we show grace, it gives God a little bit of room to work. Secondly, the brothers' consciences were awakened. They said in Genesis 44, "What can we say to my Lord, Joseph?" Judah, the oldest, kind of the ringleader of the capture Joseph and sell him to Egypt group. "What can we say? How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered your servant's guilt." That guilt that had been hidden all those years, they thought nobody knew. It's over, it was behind us. Never have to face it again. Oh, it eats at us. Now it's uncovered. Their consciences had been awakened. And thirdly, their behavior changed. Follow me on this one. They said in Genesis 43, "Now then, please let your servant," Judah saying this, "remain here in Egypt as my Lord's slave," Joseph's slave, "in place of the boy Benjamin, and let the boy Benjamin return with his brothers." So the brothers had gone home, brought Benjamin back, and now Joseph was saying, "I want Benjamin to stay here. I want you to go back and get the father." The brothers 20 years ago had a similar choice to make. Are we going to sacrifice our younger brother, then it was Joseph, are we going to sacrifice Joseph for the sake of our comfort? They had that choice again 20 years later. Are we going to sacrifice younger brother Benjamin so that we can get off the hook, so that we can go home? For whatever reasons, they changed their behavior. And this time, they didn't make the same mistake they did with Joseph. Their behavior changed. If we are going to be part of mending broken relationships, we need to assume that God wants us to be instruments of his grace. Guilt is God's job. Grace is ours. There's one more key in this story, and that is that the work that God had to do to bring the brothers to Egypt and put them in front of Joseph took about 1.5 years in the lives of Joseph's brothers. It was about that long for them to run out of grain in Canaan before they became desperate enough to go to Egypt. But it took God 20 years to prepare Joseph for that meeting. So here's key number 3. Be willing for God to work in your life first. God was going to ask Joseph to do a very, very difficult thing. And that is to show grace and reconciliation to brothers who had hurt him deeply, who had shaped his life, who had changed his life, who had changed his family's life. And Joseph, if he were going to become an instrument of God's grace, he needed to be convinced of God's grace in his own life. Evidence that that work of God was done in Joseph's life is when he told his brothers, after all they had done, after 13 years as a slave and prisoner, after all that the brothers had, how they had treated Joseph, Joseph said to them, God meant it for good. That's God's grace at work in Joseph's life. In fact, if you read through some of what Joseph said in Genesis 45, 4 times he says something like this. It was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. God sent me ahead of you to save your lives. It was not you who sent me here, but God. God has made me Lord of all, Lord of Egypt. God was doing this. God was in charge of this. Every reason to somehow think God should be working in his brother's life, but all this time, God was working in Joseph's life, convincing Joseph of God's sovereignty, of God's grace, of God's strength. Listen, if we are going to be part of mending broken relationships, we need to be convinced of the power of God's grace. Oh, God, your grace lets people off too lightly. Aren't you glad? Aren't you glad? I don't know if your grace works. If you don't think it works, you won't be an instrument of his grace. But for you to be an instrument of his grace, you first must be convinced of the power, tenacity, and the efficiency of God's grace. So here's our take-home thought. The more we experience God's grace for ourselves, the more we will be ready to participate in the mending of broken relationships in our lives. I didn't say it would be easy. It took 20 years in Joseph's life. But it's part of the mending of relationships that we become convinced of God's grace to us first. Before you ask God to work in the lives of your family or your friends, ask him to work in your life first. There was a businessman in Pittsburgh who had told his pastor of his family and how they had hurt him over the years. And the pastor challenged him to love and forgive them. And the businessman said, I can't do that to them. So rather than getting soft with the businessman or showing sympathy with him, he challenged him. Like, I challenge you. For the next 30 days, every day, pray for your family. And so the businessman accepted that challenge and began praying every day for his family. At the end of those 30 days, the businessman found out that he was the one that had changed. And it made him ready for when the opportunity came to mend a broken relationship. Didn't make it easy. There's work involved, but it made him ready for that mending of a broken relationship. Are we willing for God to work in our life first? Often when we talk to God about these broken relationships, we say something like, God, you love them, I'll change them. We ought to be saying, God, you change them, I'll love them. That's the way God's world works. That's the way his economy works. So the climax of this broken relationship story comes in Genesis 45. We pick up the story in verse 1 of Genesis 45. Then Joseph could no longer control himself. This is after several trips back and forth to Egypt and Canaan with grain and the discussion about Benjamin staying or going. Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and the Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there'll be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So that it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me Pharaoh, a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God's made me lord of Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you, your children, grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I'll provide for you there because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become desolate. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about the honor accorded me in Egypt and about everything you've seen, and bring my father down here quickly." Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin embraced him, weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterward, his brothers talked with him. What a great scene. Make a great movie, don't you think? Could God have asked you to do that? Could God have asked you to be a part of mending such a broken relationship? I mean, would you be ready to do that? How would you know if you're ready? 20 years for Joseph. How would you know if you're ready? I think Joseph's story gives us a couple of indications of when we might be ready to mend a broken relationship. First, we are ready when we can be as sensitive to their feelings as we are to our own. It is easy in a broken relationship to think of all of our hurts, all of the ways that other people have slighted us. But for Joseph, he had plenty of hurts to focus on, plenty of feelings. We've already seen a bit how he had to work through the bitterness in his own heart, otherwise God couldn't use him. But there were still those feelings that were there pretty close to the surface. While they didn't interfere with God using him, they were still there. We see it when we read phrases like he wept loudly, or he couldn't control himself. 7 times in this story of reconciliation with his brothers, we read that Joseph cried. So his emotions were there. He wasn't feeling less, but his emotions did not get in the way of his ability to have feelings and sensitivities for his brothers. For instance, he didn't embarrass them. This was a family matter. This is something between them. And so in a culture where saving face was important, he dismissed everyone else. He didn't want anyone else in the room when he revealed himself to his brothers. He identified with the concern they had for their aging father and the love that the father had for young Benjamin, now Dad's new favorite. And so he said, I'm not going to jeopardize anyone's life here. He identified with that. I mean, the brothers were in a very vulnerable position. I mean, Joseph had the drop on them. He could have given them more time in prison. After all, he'd accused them of being spies. But instead, the body language shows that Joseph wanted to assure them of his relationship to them, of his own heart, of his own motives, because the word tells us that he drew close to them. You don't draw closer to someone that you think pushed you off a wall. Joseph identified with the feelings of both groups of brothers. There are kind of 2 groups of brothers. One group with the ringleaders of selling Joseph and putting him in a pit and leading him off to Egypt. That group, they probably felt very guilty, very afraid, very frightened of what Joseph was going to do to them. And so to that group, Joseph said, "Don't be distressed." The other group of brothers who kind of went along with the larger group, the other brothers didn't want to kill him and they wanted to be as nice as possible, but now maybe they were angry at their older brothers for getting them into this mess. To that group, Joseph said, "Don't be angry." I mean, Joseph could identify with their feelings. I mean, it's easy to feel for someone who doesn't deserve to be hurt. It's a lot harder for us to identify with the feelings of someone who does deserve to be hurt. We don't want to draw close. We want there to be distance. We want to advertise our hurt. We don't want to do anything that would promote healing. Because frankly, we want people to know how this person hurt us. But if that's where we are not yet ready to mend a broken relationship. We are ready to mend a broken relationship when our feelings are sensitive to their feelings as much as we are to our own. Not to deny what we may be feeling, but to put ourselves in their place as well. Secondly, we are ready to be involved in mending a broken relationship when we can forgive them. This is a very tense moment. I mean, again, Joseph could have sent them to prison for life or worse. And they knew that. And they were frightened. But Joseph chose, after all he'd been through and all that God had taught him, Joseph chose to show them forgiveness. Now, this isn't forgiveness light. Joseph doesn't let them off the hook by blaming God. Okay, God did this. He was responsible. He was in charge. He didn't let them off the hook by saying it wasn't anything. You know, 20 years of my, you know what? It's good. It's good. No, Joseph mentioned the elephant in the room. And I suppose if you're in Egypt, it would be the camel in the room. But in any case, however they did, he said to them right up front, and very honestly, I'm the one you sold. He didn't say, I'm your younger brother Joseph. He said, no, I'm the one you sold. Ouch, ouch. He was honest about what they had done. But then he quickly acted out his heart of forgiveness by not just embracing Benjamin, but did you read? He kissed all of them. And then entered into an extended, maybe for the rest of the day, conversations. Joseph acted out forgiveness to them. For you and for me, forgiveness might include not reliving the hurt in your own mind over and over again. It might include not reminding the other person over and over again of the hurt they caused. It might include not rehearsing the hurt they caused to other people. Maybe that's when I'll know that I am truly forgiving them, gracing them, giving God room to work in their life. I didn't say it would be easy. I don't know how long it will take for God to get you there, but that's what it will take for us to be ready to mend a broken relationship. There's one more readiness factor. It is this one. We are ready when we are willing to work at the relationship. Sometimes it seems that Christians have this no-fault broken relationship thing, where we hurt each other and then we exchange information and we never see each other again. Kind of like no-fault accidents. That's not Joseph's attitude here. Follow me on this. Joseph was a very gifted, talented leader. It's what made him second in command in Egypt. He could manage people. He could manage resources. He could plan ahead. He could map out a strategy. He was a great project manager. And he put all of those talents to work for his family. They were going to have to move 70 people, several hundred miles, in the middle of a famine. And Joseph was busy planning out how they'd get here, when they'd get here, what they would bring with them, where they would settle. I mean, he was planning it all. He was putting himself to work for the relationship. I will tell you, you maybe don't need me to tell you this, that mending a broken relationship takes work on your part. For instance, the father or the daughter with the broken relationships I read about a moment ago. This was the work that was suggested for her. Start with your younger sister. Tell her you went into a tailspin when Dad died and you deeply regret abandoning her. Ask what you can do now. Then go see your mother. Phone or email your older sister. You'll have to put up with their anger and disappointment, but that will be temporary while you work on forgiveness. There's work we need to do, to be willing to do the work. For that hurting dad, this is what's suggested. Dad, you don't have to send gifts, but please continue to send cards. Your daughters need the reassurance that you still care about them, and you never know, they may someday decide to reconcile. Please leave the door open. Mending a broken relationship. I'll know I'm ready when I'm willing to work at the relationship. Not hit and run, but work at the relationship. Do you know what gave Joseph energy to work at this relationship? It wasn't because he had the time. He was a very busy second in command in Egypt. It wasn't because he liked challenges. He tells us why in Genesis 45 when we read, "But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." Joseph was motivated because he saw his brothers, his family, like God saw them. They were worth preserving. It is so easy for us in a broken relationship to have unkind labels for them. Things we call them in our alone moments, or maybe to their face. All kinds of names, but do I see them as someone worth preserving? Do I see them like God sees them? That's what gives me energy to keep working. I'm not working alone. I'm participating with God in His grace. What He's doing, awakening their conscience, changing behavior, letting them know that they're accountable to God. However God wants to work behind the scenes in their life, am I willing to work at that relationship? There's one other observation to make about Joseph that's kind of interesting, and that is, for much of this time, Joseph was able to work in mending this relationship without his brothers knowing who he was. That'd be kind of neat, wouldn't it? Which leads me to wonder, okay, if the people in my life who've hurt me didn't know it was me doing it, what would I do? If I could get away with it, what would I do? Would you do what Joseph did? But see, we have the harder task. They do know it's us. And they do know what our responses are. And so the secret of all of this mending a broken relationship begins by the broken relationship that we have with God that He mended. He showed us grace. He invited us back into that relationship because of the work He had done. In fact, in Isaiah 53, we read about that work. Let's read it together out loud to remind ourselves of the work that God did to mend our broken relationship. Let's read it together. Surely He took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered Him punished by God, stricken by Him and afflicted. But He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on Him, and by His wounds we are healed. The cross is a big part of the work that God did to mend our broken relationship to Him. God is not asking you to do anything different than what He's done in our relationship to Him, which is why our take-home thought is so important. The more we experience God's work of grace in our lives, the more ready we will be to participate in the mending of broken relationships. This morning we come to the communion table as a place where we celebrate what God has done to mend our relationship with Him. The bread, the cup represent Christ's broken body and shed blood. It's a time for us to remember, God, thank you. I don't know that I would have done it that way. Don't know if I would think it would work that way. But God did it, and He did it for us. That's where the energy we have to work on our broken relationships comes from. And when we come to this table, I'd like us to remember, do you remember when you came to Christ? I've been calling it our second birthdays. And this morning I want to invite Katie Stake to come and share with us a bit about her second birthday, just before we come to the communion table. Good morning, Katie. So, Katie is a public school teacher at which school?
Shasta Meadows School.
And what grade level do you teach?
Fourth grade.
Fourth grade. And when did you begin to realize, I know it was kind of early in your life, but when did you begin to realize that maybe teaching was something that might fit you?
I was in first grade.
First grade?
First grade, yeah. And one of my classmates had heart surgery and was gone for a long time. And when she came back, the teacher sat her next to me, unbeknownst to me, because she thought I could help her catch up. And so one day in class, I was helping her with math or whatever, and the teacher made a comment in front of the whole class that I had helped Sandy more that year than she had. And that was the first kind of inkling I got that I was able to help other people learn.
Wow. I won't ask you how many years ago that was, but that was a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A while ago.
So first grade, growing up, I think you described your home as kind of being a Leave It to Beaver home. How many of you know what that term means, Leave It to Beaver home? You remember Leave It to Beaver? Some of you do. Okay.
Leave It to Beaver home. There was mom and dad and 3 girls, and dad worked, mom stayed at home, led Girl Scout troops, took us to swim lessons, just kind of all that Leave It to Beaver on TV kind of family.
And was church a part of that family life?
Not really, no. My mom took us to an Episcopal church for a few years. She was searching, but that particular church at that particular time wasn't preaching the gospel. And so I learned Bible stories, I learned about God, but I didn't learn to know God. My dad didn't and still doesn't have anything to do with God.
So you're the only one, you're telling me you're the only one in your family who's come to be a follower of Jesus Christ. When did that journey to be a follower of Jesus Christ start for you?
So we went to the Episcopal Church, and I was drawn to God. I knew that he was real. I knew that I wanted to be with him somehow. And the doctrine of predestination is in the Bible, but it's one that's kind of hard for me to understand. But yet,
You're not alone, by the way.
Yeah, I know. But yet, in some sense, I know that God chose me.
Mm-hmm.
He chose me out of my family, and there is no reason. I have a sister who's prettier. I have a sister who's smarter, but he chose me. He chose me, and so I was always drawn. If there was any God thing going on, I wanted to be there. And it was probably 4th or 5th grade, there was an opportunity to go to a vacation Bible school one summer. And so I went, and one day the man gave a talk about repentance or something, some kind of object lesson, and gave an altar call, and he, said, come forward. But he said, don't come unless you understand. Well, I was a good girl, and I was obedient, and I didn't understand, so I didn't go. But I remember very distinctly lying in my bed that night and praying and saying, Jesus, I don't understand, but I want you. I want this. I want you in my life. I want you in my heart. And so that was the beginning.
So the seeds were sown then.
Yes.
So then junior high came along, and the normal pressures of junior high.
Yes, I did just about every dumb thing that a junior higher can do. Okay. Yeah.
Where did your journey in faith take you during those years?
It was interesting. In my hometown, there are several churches with church bells. And if I was out riding my bike to a friend's house to go do something dumb that we were doing, and I would hear the church bells, I would feel guilty. I knew I should be in church, or if my friends were going to go smoke and they were going to go hide behind this church and smoke, I couldn't go with them there, not by a church.
Mm-hmm. So where did you smoke?
Yeah. I'm not going to tell you.
Sorry, Katie.
Yeah. Yeah, no.
So the church bells.
Yeah, the church bells. And then there was a boy.
Always is.
Yeah, named Randy Burgess. And he was really cute. And I had a crush on him my entire 8th grade year. And he had choir class with my best friend. She had lots of family problems, so he invited her to church. And we lied, and we said that I was staying with her that weekend, so I had to go too.
You had to go to church also?
Yes, I had to go to church with them because he was going to take her that Sunday. And that was the beginning. That family took me to church from then through high school. And that church, it was the Alliance Church in Petaluma. And that church adopted me. They raised me. They gave me rides. They sent me to Simpson College. They raised me as a Christian. They were my parents and my grandparents and my aunts and my uncles, and they wiped my nose and helped me when my parents were divorced and my Leave It to Beaver family fell apart. They were there for me. And so I count that as kind of the beginning, when everything really solidified and I was able to really begin my journey in earnest with God. And, of course, it's gone up and down and sideways and around. But since that time, it was just after Mother's Day, and there was an evangelist and another sermon and another altar call. And that was when it all kind of came together, and I was able to really begin this journey with God.
So what we sang earlier in this service, I am his and he is mine, really became very real to you.
Yes,
very real.
so very much so.
So I am curious, when did you meet Bill, the good-looking guy that he is? I mean, he has to be better looking than Randy.
Randy, yeah, Randy. The bakers know Randy.
So,
yeah, he's...
Facebook.
Yeah, no, Facebook. We do have a 40th reunion this year, though. Oh, no.
Okay.
Oh, gosh, I didn't even think about that. No, I'm not going to see Randy. Okay. I met Bill at Neighborhood Church in the singles group. And we were married 25 years ago, coming up in June.
In
So
June.
we have a 25th
25 years in June.
anniversary.
Yeah,
Yay. Yeah.
good. So any last words you want to say to us about making this journey to come to follow Christ? Is it worth it? What are your
Oh,
thoughts?
gosh. Is it worth it? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, where would I be? I have 2 sisters. I have an older sister and a younger sister, and then my mother, who's now deceased. But these other women in my family, and I see them, and I see where they are and what their lives are like and what they've gone through, and there but for the grace of God go I. You know, and how they deal with their pain or the things that happen to them, and the strength and the resources that I have to deal with what happens to me. And I know that, you know, without God, I would be like them.
Yeah. Katie, thank you for sharing your story with us and for encouraging us in our own journeys in faith. I'm going to invite the worship team to come as we prepare for communion. And this morning, Bob and I will serve you here at the front. You come and take the cup and take the bread and return to your seat and take the bread and the cup as you will at your own convenience, your own timetable. This is an opportunity for us to thank God for the broken relationship that He has mended in our lives.